There is a behavior so common, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily interaction, that most people never think to question it. It does not look like a problem from the outside. In fact, it often looks like its opposite. It looks like consideration, like empathy, like the reasonable effort of a person who cares about being understood, who wants to be seen clearly, who takes the time to ensure that others have enough context to make sense of their choices, their feelings, their absences, their moods. It is the compulsion to explain yourself, and Carl Jung believed it was one of the most reliable signs that something had gone wrong at the very center of a person's psychological life. Not because explanation is inherently harmful, not because clarity and communication are not valuable, but because there is a specific quality to the compulsive version of self-explanation that has nothing to do with genuine communication. It is driven not by the desire to connect, but by the terror of being misunderstood. Not by the wish to share your truth, but by the need to manage how your truth is received. Not by confidence, but by a wound so old and so thoroughly integrated into daily behavior that it no longer feels like a wound. It feels like personality. It feels like simply being the kind of person who explains things. This video is about what happens when you stop. Not strategically, not as a performance of confidence, but genuinely, when you arrive, through real psychological work, at a place where the compulsive need to justify your existence to others has loosened its grip enough that silence becomes possible. Because what happens in that silence, both inside you and in the world around you, is one of the most significant transformations available to a human being. Jung called the larger process individuation. But it begins, in very practical terms, with something as simple and as radical as this. Noticing that you owe no one an explanation for being who you are. To understand why this is so difficult, you have to go back to where the pattern began. Because no one develops the compulsion to constantly explain themselves without reason. It is always learned, always a response to something specific that happened early enough and consistently enough to become the operating assumption beneath every social interaction. For most people, it begins in the experience of emotional invalidation. Not necessarily in dramatic form, not always in obvious cruelty or deliberate harm, often in the quieter, more pervasive form of a childhood environment, where the child's inner experience was consistently treated as something that needed to be justified before it could be acknowledged. You feel sad, and you are told there is no reason to feel sad. You feel afraid, and you are told you are being dramatic. You feel angry, and you are told your anger is inappropriate, disproportionate, something to be managed rather than understood. The message, delivered in 1,000 variations across the years of childhood, settles into the deepest layer of psychological assumption. What I feel does not have inherent validity. My inner experience only has value if I can convince someone else to recognize it. I must earn the right to my own emotions. And from this assumption, a behavior emerges that will follow a person into every relationship, every professional environment, every moment of conflict or difference or simple misunderstanding for the rest of their life. The reflexive, almost involuntary reaching for explanation. The immediate construction of a case for why what you feel makes sense, why what you chose was reasonable, why you are who you are rather than the version of you someone else seems to be responding to. Jung identified this as a disconnection from what he called internal authority, the innate capacity present in every human being but frequently buried under layers of conditioning to validate your own experience from within. To feel something and know it is real, not because someone else confirmed it, but because you felt it. To make a choice and know it was yours, not because you successfully defended it, but because it arose from your actual center. When internal authority is intact, explanation becomes optional. You explain when you genuinely want to be understood, when the understanding serves something real. But you do not explain to earn the right to exist. You do not justify to purchase your own validity. The two kinds of explanation, the one that comes from genuine desire to connect and the one that comes from the need to secure your own psychological legitimacy, feel different from the inside. And learning to distinguish between them is one of the first steps towards something genuinely different. Here is what compulsive self-explanation actually costs, beyond the obvious exhaustion of it. Most people are aware, on some level, that constantly justifying themselves is tiring, that there is something draining about the perpetual effort to ensure everyone around them has enough context, enough explanation, enough reason to find you acceptable. But the deeper cost is less visible, and it is the one Jung found most significant. Every time you shape your explanation to make your inner experience more palatable to someone else, you are performing a small act of self-abandonment. You take what is true, the actual feeling, the genuine reasoning, the real motivation, and you edit it. You soften the edges. You add qualifications. You preemptively address objections. You present a version of your truth that has been optimized for acceptance rather than simply expressed as it is. And in that editing, something is lost, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually across hundreds and then thousands of these small editorial decisions. The relationship between you and your own inner experience begins to shift. You stop being the primary audience for your own truth. Other people's potential responses become the filter through which you process your own experience before you have even fully felt it. You begin, in a very real sense, to know yourself primarily through the versions of yourself you have constructed for others' consumption. And the actual self, the unedited, unoptimized, not yet explained version, becomes harder to access, because you have been spending so much energy managing how it appears to others that you have had very little left to simply be with it yourself. Jung described this as the ego becoming a servant of external acceptance. The ego, which should be the center of conscious identity, the structure through which you experience yourself as a coherent person moving through the world, becomes instead a performance apparatus, continuously monitoring how you are being perceived, continuously adjusting output to minimize negative response, continuously prioritizing the management of others' impressions over the genuine experience of your own existence. This is not laziness. This is not weakness. This is the logical outcome of a system that learned, early and thoroughly, that its natural expression was not sufficient, that it needed to be explained to be accepted. That acceptance required the performance of justification, and the system adapted, as human systems always do, with tremendous efficiency and at tremendous cost. Oh, there is a specific moment that Jung's work points toward, a moment most people who have spent years in compulsive self-explanation will recognize, even if they have never named it before. It is the moment when you are explaining yourself, and you become aware, somewhere beneath the words, that it is not going to work, that the explanation you are constructing will not produce the understanding you are seeking, that the person you are explaining yourself to is not, in this moment, available to genuinely receive what you are offering. And yet you continue, not because you believe the explanation will land, but because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing, because silence in that moment feels like an admission of something you do not want to admit, like giving up, like accepting that you will be misunderstood, like allowing someone to hold an inaccurate version of you without your intervention. And the fear of that, the specific fear of being seen inaccurately and not correcting it, is itself the most revealing signal of how much of your psychological security has been placed outside yourself. Because a person with intact internal authority can be misunderstood without that misunderstanding threatening the foundation of their sense of self. The misunderstanding is uncomfortable, sometimes genuinely painful, but it does not reach the core. The core remains stable because it is grounded in something internal rather than dependent on accurate external reflection. But for the person whose psychological security lives primarily in how they are perceived, whose sense of validity depends on being understood, misunderstanding is not simply uncomfortable, it is destabilizing. It threatens the structure that self-worth has been built on. And so the explaining continues, past the point of genuine communication. past the point of genuine connection, into something that functions more like a compulsion than a choice. Jung believed this was the key signal. When explanation stops being something you choose and becomes something you cannot stop, that is when the behavior has moved from communication into symptom, into the expression of something that needs not more refined explanation, but genuine psychological attention. Now let us talk about what internal authority actually is, because it is easy to describe what it is not. Not compulsive explanation, not the performance of confidence, not the managed presentation of a self is optimized for acceptance. But the positive description requires more precision. Internal authority, as Jung understood it, is not the absence of care about how others experience you. It is not indifference to relationship, or contempt for other people's perspectives, or the particular hardness of someone who has decided that needing anything from anyone is a form of weakness. All of those are their own distortions, the shadow of internal authority, rather than the thing itself. Genuine internal authority is the capacity to hold your own experience as valid before it has been confirmed by anyone else, to feel something and trust the feeling as information, not perfect information, not infallible, but genuinely yours, and therefore worth taking seriously, without first requiring external validation of its legitimacy. To make a choice from your actual values, rather than from the anticipated reaction of others, and then to stand in that choice without the immediate need to construct a defense of it, to end a conversation when it needs to end without a 3-paragraph explanation of why, to say no without a catalog of reasons designed to make the no acceptable, to be who you are in any given moment without the running commentary of justification that converts every authentic expression into a performance. This is not achieved through a decision. It is not something you can simply choose to have on a Tuesday afternoon after watching a video about it. It develops through the slow, often uncomfortable process of noticing when you are explaining from fear rather than from genuine desire to connect. Through the even slower process of tolerating the discomfort of not explaining, of allowing the silence to exist and the potential misunderstanding to exist within it, without immediately moving to correct it. Through the accumulated experience of discovering that the things you feared would happen when you stopped explaining, the rejection, the abandonment, the loss of belonging, either do not happen, or happen in ways that reveal something important about the relationship that the constant explaining had been concealing. Jung was clear that this process was not comfortable. He called it the traversal of an inner desert, the period between the collapse of the old identity, the one organized around others' approval, and the consolidation of the new one, grounded in genuine self-knowledge. In that desert, there is genuine loneliness, the loss of the familiar, if exhausting, comfort of knowing exactly what role you are playing and how to play it well. The disorientation of a self-concept that is no longer primarily organized around how you are perceived. The strange silence of a life that is no longer filled with the constant labor of managing impressions. But Jung believed this desert was not a mistake on the path. It was the path. There is something specific that happens in your relationships when you begin to stop explaining yourself. And it is something most people do not anticipate. They expect, perhaps, that the relationships will suffer, that the people in their lives will be confused or hurt or alienated by the change, that the withdrawal of the constant justification will be experienced as coldness or distance or the signal that you no longer care enough to explain. Some of this does happen, but what also happens, and this is the part that reveals something essential about the nature of the relationships that were there before, is that certain dynamics simply lose their operational foundation. Because many of the dynamics that had been maintained through your compulsive explanation were not, at their core, about connection. They were about control, not always conscious control, not always malicious, but the specific dynamic in which your ongoing provision of justification gave other people a continued point of access to your psychological interior. a way of maintaining leverage over your sense of self by remaining the arbiters of whether your explanations were sufficient, of whether your reasons were good enough, of whether you had earned through the quality of your justification the right to feel what you felt or do what you did. When you stop providing that access, when the explanation stops arriving automatically, when the justification is no longer forthcoming on demand, that dynamic has nothing left to run on. And what happens next is revealing. Some people simply reorient. They were never primarily invested in the control the dynamic provided. The relationship had other foundations, and your change, while perhaps initially disorienting, ultimately clarifies something that was genuinely there. But others react with a disproportionate disturbance, an irritation that seems larger than the actual change warrants. A pressure, subtle or explicit, to return to the previous pattern. An accusation that you have become cold or arrogant, or that something has gone wrong with you. And those reactions, uncomfortable as they are to receive, are among the most honest information you will ever get about what the dynamic was actually built on. Jung wrote that the most subversive thing a person can do in a world built on performance is to simply be themselves without apology. Not loudly, not as a declaration, simply as the quiet, consistent, daily practice of not converting who you are into something more acceptable before allowing it to be seen. This is what stops being possible when compulsive explanation runs the show, because every explanation is, at its core, a conversion, a translation of your raw inner experience into a form that has been pre-screened for palatability, pre-checked for potential objections, pre-softened at the edges that might cause friction. And what arrives at the other person after all that translation is not you. It is the managed version of you, the version that has already accounted for their potential reactions and adjusted accordingly. Which means that even in your most earnest attempts to be understood, you are presenting something other than what needs to be understood. The actual self, the one that has not yet been edited for consumption, remains unseen. Not because others refuse to see it, because you never allowed it to be visible. Understanding why stopping is so difficult requires looking honestly at what the explaining is actually protecting, because compulsive behavior of any kind is always protecting something, always organized around the prevention of something that the psyche has determined, at some level below conscious awareness, to be genuinely threatening. For the person who cannot stop explaining themselves, what is being protected is almost always some version of the same thing. The terror of being seen and found insufficient, not misunderstood. That would be manageable, seen clearly, seen accurately, and still found to be not enough, because misunderstanding carries hope. If they only understood properly, they would accept me. If I could just explain it the right way, the rejection would dissolve. The explanation keeps the hope alive. It maintains the possibility that acceptance is one more clarification away, but being seen clearly and still rejected, that possibility closes something off entirely. It removes the hope that better explanation will eventually produce the belonging that has always been sought. And for a person whose sense of psychological safety was built on the belief that being understood leads to being accepted, that closure is experienced as something close to annihilation, which is why the explaining continues, past the point of communication, past the point of genuine connection, past the point where any rational assessment of the situation would suggest it is serving any useful purpose, because it is not serving communication anymore. It is serving the protection of a hope, the hope that the right words, assembled in the right way, will finally produce what no amount of words has yet produced. The unconditional acceptance that should have arrived early in life and did not. Jung was deeply compassionate about this dynamic. He did not treat it as weakness or failure. He treated it as the inevitable result of a psyche that had learned, under real conditions that offered no better options, that explaining was the closest available substitute for being genuinely received. But he was also clear about what it costs to remain in that substitution indefinitely. The real thing, genuine reception, genuine meeting, the actual experience of being known rather than merely explained, cannot arrive while the explaining is running, because the explaining prevents the very thing it is seeking. It keeps the interaction at the level of performance, your performance, offered for their assessment, rather than allowing it to drop into genuine contact. And genuine contact requires something the explaining mind finds almost unbearable: exposure without control. The willingness to be seen without having first managed what is visible. There is a quality that develops in people who have genuinely worked through this pattern. It is difficult to describe precisely because it is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is not the performance of confidence, the kind that is always slightly too loud, always slightly too present, always carrying the faint undertone of something that needs to be believed rather than simply expressed. It is quieter than that and more substantial. Jung sometimes described it as psychological gravity, the quality of a person whose center of mass is actually inside them rather than distributed among the perceptions of everyone around them. You have encountered this quality in certain people without being able to name exactly what you were responding to. The person who can receive criticism without either collapsing or immediately defending, who can disagree without needing to convert the other person, who can hold a position without requiring validation of it before they feel entitled to maintain it, who can sit in misunderstanding, genuine, unresolved misunderstanding, without the compulsive need to immediately correct it. Not because they do not care about being understood, but because their sense of who they are does not depend on any particular person's understanding of them for its stability. This is not coldness. It is the specific warmth that only becomes available when you are no longer spending all your relational energy on self-management. When you are not continuously monitoring how you are being perceived, you have something available that the explaining mind never quite does: genuine attention for the person in front of you, not attention divided between them and your ongoing project of managing their impression of you. Full attention. And that quality of full attention, of being genuinely present with another person, rather than simultaneously present with them and performing for them, is something people feel immediately, even when they cannot name what they are feeling, even when they only register it as the vague sense that something is different about this person, that conversations with them land differently, that being around them produces a quality of ease that most social interaction does not. Now let us address something that often creates confusion when people first encounter this idea. Stopping the compulsive explanation is not the same as refusing to communicate. It is not the adoption of strategic silence as a manipulation tool. It is not the performance of mystery. It is not the withdrawal of genuine expression in favor of inscrutability. These are all distortions of the thing, the shadow versions that arrive when the concept is applied from the ego, rather than from genuine internal development. The person who stops explaining from genuine internal authority does not become less communicative. They become more honest, because what they express, when they express it, is no longer pre-filtered through the question of whether it will be well received. It is simply true, offered not as a plea for validation, but as an expression of something real. And that difference between expression offered as a plea and expression offered as a simple statement of what is, changes the entire quality of communication. The person receiving it feels the difference even when they cannot articulate it, because a plea carries a hook, an implicit request for a specific response, a need that the listener is being enlisted to meet, and that hook, however subtle, produces a kind of resistance in the listener. The unconscious awareness that something is being asked of them, that their response carries weight, that they are being positioned as the arbiter of something. But expression without a hook, words that arrive simply as what is true for the person speaking, without the embedded need for a particular reception, lands differently. It creates space rather than demand, and paradoxically, it invites genuine response far more reliably than the plea it replaces, because people move toward what does not need them, and away, gradually and inevitably, from what requires their ongoing validation to sustain itself. Jung believed that the journey toward genuine selfhood, individuation in his precise language, required a series of encounters with what he called the inferior function. The parts of the psyche that have been least developed, most avoided, most thoroughly subordinated to the demands of social functioning. For many people who struggle with compulsive self-explanation, one of the most underdeveloped capacities is exactly this: the ability to tolerate being misunderstood without moving immediately to correct the misunderstanding, to allow an inaccurate perception of you to exist in the world, in someone else's mind, in the space between you, without treating that inaccuracy as an emergency requiring immediate intervention. This sounds simple. It is not simple, because the nervous system of a person who learned early that misunderstanding was dangerous, who learned that being seen inaccurately led to punishment or withdrawal of love or loss of belonging, responds to misunderstanding with genuine alarm, not metaphorical alarm. The actual physiological signal of threat. The body preparing to respond to something it has categorized, based on early and consistent experience, as genuinely dangerous, and the explanation is the response, the attempt to neutralize the threat by correcting the perception before the consequences of the inaccuracy can arrive. Working with this pattern requires something more fundamental than deciding to explain less. It requires, over time and through repeated experience, updating the threat assessment, learning at a level below rational understanding, at the level of the nervous system itself, that misunderstanding is not dangerous in the way it once was, that an inaccurate perception of you held by someone else does not have the power it once had to determine whether you are safe, loved, or belonging. Because the conditions that made misunderstanding dangerous were the conditions of childhood, when you were genuinely dependent on specific people's accurate perception of you for your actual safety and well-being. Those conditions are no longer present, but the nervous system has not received the update, and until it does, until the body learns, through accumulated experience of surviving misunderstanding without catastrophe, that the threat is not what it was, the explaining will continue to feel not like a choice, but like a necessity. This is why intellectual understanding of the pattern is almost never sufficient to change it. You can understand everything that has been said in this video with complete accuracy, and still find, in the next conversation where misunderstanding appears on the horizon, that the words are forming before you have made any conscious decision to produce them. The understanding has to move from the mind into the body, from concept into lived experience, through the gradual, uncomfortable, genuinely courageous practice of staying in the discomfort of misunderstanding, long enough for the nervous system to discover that it can survive, that nothing catastrophic occurs, that the ground holds. What becomes possible when the explaining stops is worth describing carefully, not because it is dramatic, but because it is so qualitatively different from what most people have experienced in their social lives that it can be difficult to believe it is available. The first thing that becomes possible is genuine rest, not the rest of isolation or withdrawal, the rest that comes from no longer expending the enormous amount of energy that compulsive self-explanation requires. The continuous monitoring, the real-time assessment of how you are being perceived, the rapid construction of justifications, the ongoing management of impressions, all of that is labor, invisible labor, largely unconscious but consuming in a way that contributes to a specific kind of exhaustion that is impossible to sleep off. Because it does not stop when you leave the conversation. It continues in the rehearsal of what you should have said, in the anticipation of the next opportunity to clarify, in the background processing of every interaction for evidence of how it was received. When that labor lightens, even partially, even imperfectly, something becomes available in its place. Not immediately, but gradually. A quality of presence in your own experience that the divided attention of self-management had been consuming. The capacity to actually feel what you feel, rather than immediately converting it into something explainable, to make choices from your genuine values rather than from the anticipated need to justify them afterward, to be in relationships without the continuous performance of being in them. The second thing that becomes possible is a different quality of relationship altogether, not with everyone, but with the people who remain when the explaining stops. Because the people who remain, who do not require your constant justification as the price of their continued presence, or are relating to something more real than the people who were primarily in relationship with your explanations. And relationship with something real has a completely different texture than relationship with a carefully managed performance. It is less comfortable in some ways, less predictable, less smoothly maintained, but it carries something the other kind could never carry: the actual experience of being known, not the experience of having successfully explained yourself, but the rarer, more sustaining experience of being seen without the explanation, without the justification, without the pre-filtered presentation, and met there. Jung said something toward the end of his life that functions less as a philosophical statement and more as a description of something he had witnessed repeatedly in the people who had done genuine psychological work. He said that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are, not the explained version, not the version optimized for acceptance, not the character that learned, under real pressure and with genuine stakes, to justify its existence as the price of belonging. Who you truly are. And becoming that, genuinely, not as performance, requires eventually arriving at the place where the explaining is no longer the condition under which you allow yourself to exist, where your presence does not require a defense, where your feelings do not require a case to be built around them before you trust them as real, where your choices do not require pre-approval from the people who might be affected by them, where silence, genuine silence, the silence of a person who has something to say and is choosing not to say it, rather than the anxious silence of someone who cannot find the right words, becomes available as a real option. Oh, this is not the end of communication. It is the beginning of honest communication, for perhaps the first time, because what you express when you are no longer explaining from fear is actually yours, not the version constructed for someone else's consumption, not the translation optimized for acceptance, the thing itself. And the thing itself, however imperfect, however contradictory, however far from the version you might have designed if you were designing yourself for an audience, has a quality that the explained version never does. It is real, and reality, offered honestly in the space between two people, is the only foundation on which anything genuinely worth building can stand. If something in this reached further than you expected, if there is a specific explanation you have been giving for years that you recognized somewhere in what was said here, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been most tired of justifying, because noticing it is the beginning of no longer needing to.